Our top story, India and Japan held bilateral talks ahead of Shinzo Abe's state funeral in Tokyo. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Japanese PM Fumio Kishida held talks as part of Kishida's funeral diplomacy. The meet comes as world leaders from all across the globe are reaching Tokyo to attend the state funeral of slain Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Representatives from over 100 countries, including more than 20 heads of state, are expected to attend that mega state funeral of Japan's longest-serving prime minister, who was assassinated on the 8th of July during a campaign speech in the city of Nara. Apart from Prime Minister Modi, other prominent faces include US Vice President Kamala Harris, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. However, the state-sponsored ceremony for Abe has drawn criticism from local residents and leaders due to several reasons, including the high costs involved.
ये दुख की घड़ी में आज हम मिल रहे हैं क्योंकि पिछली बार जब मैं आया तब आबे शान से बहुत लंबी बातें हुई थी और हमारी दोस्ती ने एक वैश्विक प्रभाव पैदा करने में भी बहुत बड़ी भूमिका निभाई। भारत और जापान की दोस्ती ने, और इन सब के लिए आज भारत की जनता आबे शान को बहुत याद करती है, जापान को बहुत याद करती है। भारत एक प्रकार से आबे शान को मिस कर रही है, लेकिन मुझे विश्वास है कि आपके नेतृत्व में भारत जापान संबंध और अधिक गहरे होंगे।
Maroof Raza, Group Consulting Editor of the Times Network, joining us right now. Good morning, Maroof. You know, this is a crucial meeting between India and Japan. What will be the key points of discussion and how prominently is China likely to figure in those discussions?
Well, China is going to be the big elephant in the room. It has always been for a variety of reasons. China and Japan have a long-standing animosity and hostility. Japan has stood up to China even in recent times. In fact, the late Mr. Shinzo Abe is being referred to as the man who initiated the Quad, as Quad father, and the Quad China clearly sees as an initiative aimed at China. And even now for Mr. Abe's funeral, China is one country that has sent insignificant member of the Chinese establishment, a minister for science and technology, for his funeral, whereas like the funeral for Her Majesty the Queen, this funeral has drawn many important heads of government and heads of state from all over the world. It has come in for criticism within Japan for 2-3 reasons. One is the fact that the cost of the funeral, targeted to be about $11.4 million, is something that the Japanese people feel is something they could avoid. Secondly, only in 1967, after World War II, did Japan give a state funeral to anybody other than a member of the royal family. So state funerals are not a given thing in Japan. And also the fact that the Japanese see Mr. Abe for militarizing the Japanese system and going against the constitution, which was imposed on them by the Americans after World War II. But the constitution forbids Japan from any warlike activity or getting involved in wars and conflict. But Mr. Abe did not go in for a referendum for that because he would have probably lost that. But he altered the interpretation of the constitution. But the Japanese see that the Abe legacy is going to haunt them because Mr. Abe initiated a very strong proactive approach against China. And China obviously sees Japan as its primary rival in East Asia. Also the fact that Mr. Abe was one person who reached out extensively to India. It was for that reason that India also gave one-day state mourning when he passed away, a rarity for a foreign leader. And the fact that Japan-India economic and trade partnership has gone from strength to strength, basically on his initiative and his relationship with Prime Minister Modi, which has led to Japanese investments in India, of the scale that few countries have matched. So clearly, there is a Japanese footprint in India, and Mr. Abe should be given credit for initiating that. Clearly, Mr. Abe's legacy on how Japan should confront the Chinese has become a more realistic approach to Japan's foreign relations, because Japan was always seen as an economic giant but a military dwarf under America's shadow. Japan has the capacity to come and stand up on its own and at least unsettle China with its ambitions in East Asia. And if more countries like Japan, India, and some in Southeast Asia are able to stand up to the Chinese, China's ambition of dominating Asia would receive that much of a setback. Back to you.
Maroof, also talk to us a little bit about India-Japan ties. Mr. Abe and Mr. Modi have had a great personal connect and they built on those ties. So how important are India-Japan ties in today's scenario, given the Chinese aggression as well?
They are very important. For one reason is the fact that the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, as we all know, has been spreading all over the world, most aggressively in Asia. India is one country that has stood up to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And some people who were critical of India's stance on this subject felt that India was losing out on Chinese investments in India. Chinese investments are still happening in India, and China is doing roaring business in India. Unfortunately, the balance is in China's favor of 2/3 to 1/3 of a trade which is now, I believe, touching $100 billion. But India-Japan ties is a counter to that. Japan has chosen to invest in India, most visibly in the high-speed rail corridors that have come into being or are due to get inaugurated very soon between Ahmedabad and Mumbai, and there's another one in South India. Also, Japanese industrial investment in India is enormous. Still, more than 50% of the cars in India are of Japanese make, and everyone is conscious of that. Japanese technology has always been not so cheap as Chinese, but very high quality. India can really take this relationship aggressively forward and allow the Japanese to become the go-to investment partner, because Japan, the economy is not growing very rapidly, but they have a lot of money. It is Japan that has made Southeast Asia what it is. China has now gotten there and established its footprint. But I've been in Southeast Asia and some countries, and they clearly say it was Japan that really made them from what they were after Second World War. And also the fact that Japan has the technology edge over most countries in all over the world. So India can actually match up with Japan and create some Indo-Japanese technology, which would particularly be able to take greater markets in Africa. Japan is also an investor in Africa, and India has very, very clear interests in Africa, having in recent years set up more than 28 missions in African countries. India is keen to do that, but India's willingness has to be backed up with deep pockets. And the only other country in Asia that has deep pockets other than China is Japan. Obviously, we do not want to link up with China.
Right.
So we are going to use Japan as a partner for furthering at least our ambitions in Asia.
All right, Maroof Raza, we leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us with your perspective on this rather important meeting that's taking place in Japan today.